Ever since speaking in tongues appeared in the Bible, or probably a long time before that if we're being honest, the concept of one magical person communicating with everyone on the planet in every language at once has fascinated people. The Protestant Reformation brought in a new wave of Christians who believed in the permanence of this miracle, that the faithful have been granted access to the ability to speak in tongues and at times miraculously get understood by speakers of entirely foreign languages. Most people view these practices with suspicion, since on the face of it, these miracles sound like linguistic gibberish. But if we've ever accomplished something close to the ability to speak in tongues as a species, it would be through instrumental music. Especially the abstract freedom of improvised jazz conjures up similarities in our minds to the practice of speaking in tongues, something with which voices in experimental jazz took more of an overt interest in the early 1960s. Today, we're talking about one of the foremost figures in spiritual experimental jazz from an era when those religious themes were only just starting to appear in his work. Specifically, we're talking about My Favorite Things by John Coltrane. On the face of it, the concept behind this album couldn't get more simple. You take some standards, one of which is one of the most recognizable songs of all time, and you whittle them down to the minimalist foundations of a cool jazz song. Specifically, the highly active but disproportionately mild piano plays in a technique that seems to pull equally from classical and jazz influences. It therefore mirrors the type of cool style epitomized by Dave Brubeck and sets the emotional atmosphere and molds the song's structures. The album gets split in half, in classic Coltrane fashion for this period. The first and the third tracks follow a modal theoretical framework, but the second and fourth tracks remain in a more traditional tonal framework. However, throughout the album, the piano sticks with us to keep the record feeling aesthetically unified, additionally keeping these standards thematically recognizable as Coltrane freely improvises in all directions. From this immediately approachable core, this warm, comfortable blanket of piano, drums, and bass, Coltrane introduces some of his most abstract melodic work up to this point in his career. The first two tracks showcase Coltrane on the soprano saxophone, a higher-pitched version of his typical instrument, the tenor sax, which he switches back to on the last two tracks of the album. Playing in this higher register generally puts his melodies in the same frequency range as a human singing voice, and the instrument's straight shape creates such an intimate and noticeable tie between the player and the sound. Of course, all musical performance, and especially jazz improvisation, serves as an act of self-expression, but this sort of direct analog to the voice helps us feel that immediacy, serving as a constant reminder that we're being given access to the interior of the artist's soul. In those moments when Coltrane swerves away from reiterating the song's core melodic theme, he improvises on planes that we may not even consider possible at first, moving beyond the spontaneous writing of notes and rhythms into a deeper exploration of timbre and texture. So transcribing Coltrane's work here onto a piece of sheet music, no matter how detailed you make those instructions, would do pretty much nothing. The entire package arrives as one incomprehensible emotional statement, like a charismatic Christian speaking in tongues. But this logical psychological comparison isn't what research shows us. In fact, according to the limited scientific data that we have on Christians who speak in tongues and jazz improvisers, those two practices that seem similar on the surface have deeply separate psychology. Jazz improvisation activates most of the same parts of the brain that are responsible for formulating speech, most specifically those areas in charge of adhering to rules of grammar and syntax, all while decreasing activity in the portion of the brain that's in charge of constructing concrete meaning from incoming language data. In this way, you can think of improvisation as ungoverned abstract speech, that sort of creativity that we also see in freeform poetry that may or may not make sense line by line, but hits you with an inexplicable emotional impact when taken as a whole. However, this speech is still fundamentally organized, a highly intentional piece of creativity, which by its nature conveys meaning outside of methods of traditional language, but it still has a meaning contained within that was constructed purposefully. On the other hand, speaking in tongues mostly shuts down all of the brain's regulatory processes, allowing a pure stream of energy to emerge from the vocal cords that isn't accountable to any rules or acute meaning. Aside from its origin in the mouth, speaking in tongues otherwise doesn't function much like speech at all. Instead, it's a pure release of energy, a rare example of pure abstraction and catharsis. So, speaking in tongues takes a further step towards abstraction when compared to jazz improvisation, but its function deviates so wildly from jazz improvisation as to justify labeling them as two completely separate activities which achieve separate goals. Like language, jazz improvisation still fundamentally serves as communication, serving both the sender and the receiver as the contents constitute a structured message, even if that structure requires intimate and at times seemingly esoteric knowledge to unpack. Speaking in tongues completely removes the receiver from the equation and therefore doesn't function as communication at all, a pure expressive outlet which serves the same purpose for one person alone in a room as if that person had a microphone and was standing in front of a crowd. However, Coltrane's Coltrane's unique position as a deeply religious man, a religiosity which was only deepening around the time of this record's release, and one of the most abstract jazz voices of his generation, points towards a possible convergence of these two streams of thought into a deeply and mysteriously spiritual jazz. Coltrane would experience a religious awakening in 1957, which would lead him to kick his heroin habit and regain the trust and respect of the jazz scene after years of erratic behavior. This awakening would take him to all kinds of places, both back to the Christianity of his upbringing, as well as from other religious traditions which were experiencing an upswing in the late 1950s and early 60s in America, like Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Coltrane would roughly stake out his position as an independently religious person with deep respect for all traditions, expressing his own religiosity through his music with increasing transparency until the albums themselves became unquestionably religious in nature. Here, we find him about halfway between his awakening and his fully religious releases, when religious exploration and expression played a large role in Coltrane's life, but he still felt he could adequately contain that expression within covers of old show tunes. So when Coltrane makes a spiritual statement through his saxophone on this record, he still has that attention to syntax and guardrails which you'd expect based on that study of neuroscience on jazz improvisation. But what we're hearing leans so heavily into a focus on delivery, the growly notes, the intermittent squeals, the mad chromatic runs, that it starts to push at the limits of structured language, turning into a charismatic outburst at least in the vicinity of speaking in tongues. What we find here feels accidental, that we've intercepted a message not meant for us couched within an approachable collection of cool jazz covers. But Coltrane beamed these transcendent messages into unsuspecting American living rooms for a reason. As a supporter of the idea of multiple paths reaching salvation, or perhaps over a hesitation to hand over religious truth to any single well-financed organization, Coltrane's religious epiphany could only be conveyed on the fringes of language. Any introduction of terminology to the equation, including even the name of God, would slot Coltrane's messaging into one or another historical funnel which would drop us at the feet of a domineering institution. Instead, he gives us a message one part structure, one part cathartic release. A statement with the manic energy of a bout of speaking in tongues, but with the restraint of a carefully worded sermon. By decoupling language from faith, Coltrane points us towards a future where truth transcends anyone's ability to hijack and take advantage of it, where religion enters the community through art and enters hearts through the radiance of divinely inspired creativity. So thanks for watching. I get the impression that pseudo-intellectual essays about the ties between speaking in tongues and the work of John Coltrane isn't exactly something the algorithm is super interested in promoting to everybody. But I've been seeing the comments, it seems like there's a small collection of people that are really into this series, so if y'all could share it to some friends who are like-minded, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you guys for staying tuned.